Hi, everybody. I'm Casey Lau. I'm the host of the Hyper Room podcast. And as part of San Diego at Home this year, I'm working with Icon Heroes Pat Wang to bring you some exciting celebrity interviews. What is your relationship, Pat, with the new Teen Titans?
It's something that I worked on actually about maybe a couple of years ago. We looked around. We did a lot of DC Comics products, and there wasn't really a whole lot of that Marv Wolfman, George Perez style out there. So we figured we'd take a shot and start developing some of them. And so we did Nightwing, we did Starfire, Cyborg, Changeling, Raven, and Deathstroke. And we came with a Titans Tower, and it did awesome. And we sold out of it. We're completely sold out of it right now. Marv was kind enough to come to our booth last summer also to sign some. So that was great.
So I see there's a guy next to you right now, very, very classic character. Who is that?
Yeah. This is Nightwing right here. They've never did a statue based on this outfit before. So it's something that we're really proud of.
Very good, very good. So I'd like to also welcome and introduce you to the legendary co-creator of the new Teen Titans. Today on the 40th anniversary of the very first issue that came out from DC Comics, Mr. Marv Wolfman. Marv, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well.
You look like you're near Titans Tower, but where are you really?
I'm in Southern California.
Great.
Titans Tower can be anywhere I am.
Exactly. So what have you been doing in lockdown these past few months?
Writing, besides all the regular work that has to be done around the house, but primarily writing. I did a Wonder Woman story, a Flash story, a Solomon Grundy, a whole bunch of different type of detective story. So I'm still working. Great.
Excellent. And did DC have a plan maybe for this year for New Teen Titans 40th anniversary that may have been, challenged because of the current pandemic?
I don't think so. At least I was never told.
Okay.
There's no special that I'm aware of, but then again, it could be.
I feel like every year in these past few years has been the Titans anniversary. There's so much new content, new shows, new products, everything out about the Titans. So it always feels like there's something going on with the new Teen Titans. But specifically, I wanted to go all the way back to like 1980. And, you've told this story many times, but I want to hear it again from you directly. Teen Titans had their own comic book series in the 70s that was, filled with Robin, Aqualad, Wonder Girl, and Speedy, the kind of kid sidekicks of all the main superheroes from DC Comics. And I don't think it did very well and it got canceled. And then you came along and you said, you know what, I've got a new idea to revive it. Tell us a little bit, how did that process work? How did you pitch it? And what do you think it was the twist of the gimmick that got you to be able to do it again?
Well, fortunately, there had been actually a Titan series back in the 60s, which I did work on.
Wow.
The original origin of Wonder Girl appeared in, I think, Titans 20 or something like that. I'm not for sure of the numbers, but the Wonder Girl origin was there, and that was my script back in the late 60s. Then I went over to Marvel, and I was there for 8 years. Meanwhile, they launched as a new Titans, and unfortunately that didn't do too well. And at that point I was leaving Marvel, and this is a decade later, and coming back to DC. And I had asked when I was coming to DC not to be on any team books. And I don't mean things like Titans. I meant like I was writing Marvel 2-in-1 at Marvel, and I don't like those type of books. They're, to me, a little bit artificial. So they assigned me, of course, to DC Presents, which was a team-up book. So I said, I got to get off this book real fast. I'd always liked the Titans, and as I said, I wrote a couple of stories for them, and decided to pitch it again, but this time with new characters, not following the DC format. I had just come back from Marvel, so I was much more action-driven at that particular point, and a very heavy characterization. I worked up the storyline, figured out the characters that I wanted. Then I ran into George Perez, and mentioned what I was doing, and if he was interested, and he was. He primarily, though, wanted to be on Justice League, and I wanted to be on Superman. And frankly, we thought the Titans, DC at that point did not have any books that were selling enormously well, and we didn't think the Titans would make it. But we sat down and said, look, it's probably going to last 6 issues, maybe a few more than that, but let's finally do the one book we always wanted to do, exactly the way we wanted to do it. It's going to be canceled. They're not going to pay any attention to it because Titans didn't have a history of selling. Yeah. And George and I both decided, let's just do it, but do it our way. And we did it, and lo and behold, 40 years later.
Incredible. So I want to know a little bit about, okay, so you chose the core team, right? The Robin, Wonder Girl, Kid Flash, these are the classic characters. And then you created 4 new characters. Where did they come from? And do you think that was the kind of new take that was going to get people to accept it within DC?
Well, I think that when you start creating some new characters that are going to have a lot more action and backgrounds, and just the style that we were doing at Marvel, where you delve deep into the characters, that hadn't been done. DC for many years. I mean, I love working with them, and I love the characters, but the characters were aimed at a slightly younger audience, and they were immeasurably successful. But I wanted to do the different type of story, and George wanted to do a different type of story. So part of what we did was we created characters that could add all those things into it that we wanted. Each character in the Titans was created or altered so that we had a way of leading into any story we wanted. An example, if we wanted a detective story, a mystery, you have Robin as the main character. If you want a space story, a science fiction story, you have Starfire as the leading character. If you wanted more of a tech story, you have Cyborg. If you want mythology, you have Raven. So there's one of each of these iconic type characters that allow you to tell any story that you want, but make it personal because they're all personally involved with it.
You've said in the past that the New Teen Titans were more like the Fantastic Four than they were the X-Men. But your description just now really reminded me like how the X-Men were like that. They were all from different parts of the world. They all had kind of different origins, so that the writers could go in those different directions in those stories.
X-Men was primarily, I know I was never an X-Men fan, so I barely read them. I was much more of a Fantastic Four fan. But the thing with the X-Men that I was familiar with, certainly, was that they were a team of all these characters coming together. But there wasn't a reason that they specifically came together. What I liked about the Fantastic Four was they were a family. Everyone got to be family very quickly. And what George and I wanted to do was turn the Titans into a family-driven book so that there'd be a reason all the characters were there. There'd be a reason why the characters could function together or have problems with each other. It was all built into their origins. Mm-hmm. And I didn't read enough of the X-Men to know if they moved in that direction, but when I had read the X-Men, they were not like that. Yeah. But yes, we both, Chris Claremont and I, both were seeking to do a more adult version of the characters that had been there previously, bringing it up to date, because those characters were created in 1960 something. Yeah. Same with the Titans. And now we wanted to bring it up to 1985 or 1980. And they're very different type of thinking process involved in doing a story in 1980 than there was in 1960s.
Yeah. Let's go back to the DC Comics Presents number 26. Like, this was an interesting thing that DC was doing at the time, producing sample stories of new comics inside other books. Talk a little bit about how you came up with that story, because it kind of like introduced everybody but it wasn't the first like story. It was kind of like a dream. Robin was like, is this real? And how it led into the actual New Teen Titans #1.
What happened was George and I did the first issue of the Titans, and it was done, it was finished. And the publisher, Jeanette Kahn, saw it, and she said, we got to publicize this. We got to get the word out. What if we gave out a free comic? What if we took a comic and added a whole new story to it, but didn't charge any more for it, so it was essentially a free book? And we're going, oh, wow, no one's ever done anything like that before. It was an incredible concept. It was very risky because that was a 16-page story, and that's expensive. You know, even if we weren't getting our rates, and we did, George and I had higher rates than a lot of people, it was still something that was going to cost DC an awful lot to do, but there was no hesitation. They wanted to make it they wanted to show the readers that they had a lot of faith in the book, that they loved it, and they wanted to give it away free so that people would have more of a reason to get it. They put it in the back of DC Presents. Yeah. And I wrote the first story in that book as well.
Yep.
And drawn by Jim Stalin.
Yeah.
So
to me, it's the most famous issue of DC Comics Presents. It's Superman and Green Lantern only because the New Teen Titans' first appearance is in that book.
I would like to think that we did a good job with the first story too. But
so you were saying, so you're thinking that this Jeanette Kahn's idea, this was the very first DC bonus book. I
could be wrong there, but as far as I know, nobody had done that before. So what we wanted to do, because the Titans get together in the first issue of the regular comic, so we couldn't have them get together in this freebie in the giveaway story. It had to be a different type of story. So planting it as sort of a dream sequence, using Raven, who is very manipulative. I mean, she's the one who sort of convinced Kid Flash by making him fall in love with her. Now, that's not the nicest thing in the world to do, but she's the sort of the focus of the entire series. She's always been the main character in this series, and so much of the series has depended upon her. So she was then we used her then in this giveaway, in this special book, to sort of introduce everybody, but not make it a story that would affect where we were going in the future. It was introduce the characters, make the characters wonder what's going on. Who is this Raven that's turning Kid Flash into this? Who is Cyborg? Who is Starfire? Who are all these characters? And you'd have to wait and buy the first issue of the regular comic to find out.
I want to know a little bit about how you chose Changeling to be in the group. Growing up back in the 80s, there were no like digital comics or reprints of all the old Doom Patrol. So when I got to issue 13, you find out there's this whole Doom Patrol Robot Man thing going on that I'd never heard of the Doom Patrol before. So as you know, back in the 80s, you couldn't go back and find out where this character came from. And then later on, when I did find out that Garfield Logan was a little kid in Doom Patrol and that you aged him up and brought him into the series, he was a pre-existing character. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with Doom Patrol and Changeling?
He was, like Robin, like Kid Flash, like Wonder Girl. He was an older character from DC. What I wanted there, and I think what George and I both wanted, was we had the storyline, and we knew what the storyline with Raven was, so we knew it was really dark. I mean, your father is essentially an intergalactic murderer. So we knew this was very dark, and I always like to put some light moments in a comic. Even when I was writing Dracula, I had a funny character, Harold H. Harold, because sometimes you have to lighten the mood just before you go very dark again. And you want something there. So Changeling or Beast Boy, which is what he was called back then, was a perfect character for that. I was a huge Doom Patrol fan. I really was. You can tell because I brought the Doom Patrol back into the Titans pretty quickly, just for a 3-parter, but still within the first year. And I remember DC was very surprised that I would do that because they didn't think anybody cared about the Doom Patrol. And then George and I did the Doom Patrol, and suddenly all these people came out saying how much they loved it, and they brought back the Doom Patrol book with that. So Beast Boy was used for comedy relief in many ways. He was used because his power was really a cool one, changed into all these animals. And it allowed us to have a different type of adventure and different type of character for it. He lightened the mood. He made it possible for people to care. He was more of the way into the stories. If you've never read a Titan stories, here's a character who's sort of fun and you could follow a little bit.
He felt the most like a teenager in the whole book, and I think he was the most popular character for a point there, right?
I don't know if he was ever that popular, but I enjoyed writing him. You'd have to ask the fans on that one. I always assumed Starfire or Raven were more popular.
And then let's talk a little bit about your working relationship with George Perez. He is quite an amazing artist, and I want to know. I've always wanted to know your working relationship, because I understand it like in Marvel. There's a Marvel style, there's a DC style. I believe you two lived close together while you were doing the series, so that you could talk over the ideas and things like that. But looking back at the books today, the layouts and the way the page stories are being done are very, very intricate, even for the 80s. Maybe talk a little bit about what was the give and take between development of the story? Because I know the credits were always you guys.
Well, George and I lived about 5 blocks apart, so we would get together. In the very beginning, I would give him a fairly tight plot. This is called the plot style or the Marvel method. But I'd give him an incredibly tight plot. Then George was, from day one, because I had worked with George at Marvel and I knew what he could do, he was always free to make all the changes he wanted. The reason for the plot was to let him know the direction of the story. If he came up with a better bit visually, if he came up with an idea that would make the characters resonate a little bit. I like working with not an artist, but a partner. And George was probably the best partner I ever worked with on the material. He can not only draw better than virtually everybody, but his storytelling was beautiful. I mean, his storytelling was precise. So in the beginning, I would give him the plots and he was free to make the changes he wanted. As we developed a little bit more, by issue 8, I think it was, when we did A Day in the Life, he and I would get together and I'd talk the plot. And I'd say what I thought should be. He was now going off and taking what we talked about briefly and converting into a story. Later, I would just come on, we'd get together for a several-hour lunch at a restaurant between us. And I would come in maybe with a couple of sentences of what the story was. And then he'd go off and do what he did, and then I'd get it back, and then I'd sort of get the story told, and if something was missed, I could find a way to make it work in the dialogue. I could explain whatever was necessary, because his storytelling was so precise and so perfect, nothing was ever wrong. It was just a different avenue, and I could take that avenue as quickly as he could. One of the things we loved doing, both of us back and forth, was testing each other as a fun. So he would introduce a bunch of characters, not tell me what he intended, and then I'd have to guess from the artwork, and I always got it because his artwork was that clear and that perfectly told.
Let's talk a little bit about New Teen Titans number 8. You brought up The Day in the Life. That, I think, is quite a landmark issue, because up to that point, there's a lot of action, a lot of fighting. It is targeted at teenage boys. And all of a sudden you decide to slow it down completely and do like a background. And as a reader, as a young reader, I was like, this is fantastic too. Talk a little bit about, how did you get that out? Was there any resistance in producing a story like that? Or were you guys already doing so well that you could play around with the format?
There was nobody supervising us. We did the story we wanted. We just had, but you have to remember, put it in context, we had just done a several-part story with Trigon. It was a really dark story. It was solid action. And both George and I felt now it's a great time to slow down a bit, but primarily let the readers know who all of these new characters are. We caught them in the midst of action, but now we could see how they react to things, who they are, who they care, what they care about, what their backgrounds are. Do they have friends? Do they have lives outside of the Titans? How do they survive? How do they live on a regular basis? And we just decided to do a story with no villains. No reason not to. I mean, there's no law that says you have to put a villain into a story. We just decided to tell a story about these characters and let the readers know we're primarily interested in who these people are and why you should care about them, not what the big action scene is going to be. Because frankly, I defy you to remember any of the action scenes you've ever seen in comics. What you remember are the characters and the stories.
Absolutely.
And it turned out that everyone just loved it. We didn't know if people would like it or dislike it, but it turned out that they really did love it.
Well, that's even calling it short. Like, that's true. You did an amazing job with the characterization, but the action in the series is also incredible. The villains that you created for the new Teen Titans, I think, still stand as like the best. Maybe even just equal to Batman. You've got Deathstroke, the Terminator, the Brotherhood of Evil, Brother Blood. That character scared me a lot when I was a kid. Where did these villains come from? They were all super original. They weren't based on anything else, and they just seemed like, and they were fighting basically teenagers, right? These are all adults like beating on little kids.
Yeah, first of all, one of our attitudes with the book, was we weren't going to treat them like little kids with little kid stories. We were going to treat them as superheroes who are as good as anybody. I resisted and succeeded in making sure we never had an adult mentor in the book.
Yes.
There used to be one in the early Titans runs, and I absolutely refused to put any adult in charge of anything. These kids were not 12 years old. They were 17, 18, 19. I remembered what I was like as an adult, so it was pretty easy for me to translate that into the characters themselves. They can think for themselves, they can act for themselves. They don't need people coming out and telling them what to do, and they wouldn't listen anyway. What was the other part of the question?
No, I was just thinking, how did those the villains get created necessarily? Like, I mean, Plasmus and Brother Blood and his whole church. That's just so disturbing as a child to read this kind of stuff.
Well, if you go back to my Marvel days, you'll remember that I did Black Cat, I did Bullseye,
Yep.
I did Blade, who was not a hero really. I did Terax. I did all these characters. I have an affinity for villains. I just enjoy writing them, and I've been lucky in that virtually every villain I've come up with has been picked up either in cartoons, live action, or something else as well. So I enjoy doing that. And then you add in George's ability to design characters that is better than anybody else's. It just made for good characters. But the characters come because I really enjoy writing that type of character. You can do an awful lot with a good villain, and the better you make the villain, the better the heroes are.
I agree. Absolutely. And I feel like, obviously, when you're developing the original New Teen Titans storyline, Deathstroke the Terminator must have been like the number one, the Joker character that you were developing, because his storyline is so integrated with the future of the series over the next 5, 10, and then today, it's such a huge character by itself. But talk a little bit about the creation of that specific character. And then did you actually know the whole story, like toward the Judas Contract, when they actually showed the whole origin? It was just fascinating. It's like, this guy's been plotting this for 5, 6 years already.
We didn't know every detail. We certainly knew the major points, but we didn't work out all the little details, because if you I enjoy working in advance. And in Dracula, I used to work 3 years in advance. I had them all plotted out for 3 years. In Titans, I wanted to react to what we were doing. And that meant if we couldn't lock ourselves into everything, but we knew the basics of the character. Deathstroke was created at the same time that the Titans were, because even though he's not in issue 1, he appears in issue 2. His son is in issue 1, and his son's death is what causes him to come into the story. So
Yeah.
he had to be plotted. He had to be intricate to the first issue, even though you didn't see him in it.
Yeah.
Everything was leading in that first issue to get him to appear in the second one. How he came together, he's one of 2 characters, Blade being the other, that came to me in like 1 second. Literally, I have no idea how he came to be. You know, you look at Brother Blood, he was a character that took a while to develop. And that came from seeing all the televangelists. But what if they were actually villains and just taking it in a completely new way, and sort of making it a Jim Jones type of situation where they're the believers who would believe right to their own deaths. But you always take several steps further. You start with that, then you go to you go further into it.
I've been rereading the books in anticipation of this interview, and I guess when you read it the first time, it rolls very, very smoothly. But then when you reread it, knowing what's going to happen, even though you said you play to it as you go along, I feel like you plotted this thing out ages ago with the appearance. I saw the Monitor at least 3 years before he shows up in the Crisis.
Yeah.
Tara even shows up before she has a cameo. You've got all kinds of little Easter egg characters that don't kind of come to fruition till later. I don't think any other comic book has ever played out this far ahead of time. Can you talk a little bit about, are those accidents or were they actually planned that way?
Well, almost all of them were planned, but not everyone. You know, but it's like I knew everything about Deathstroke, but not the intricacies of how he was in the army or how that stuff wasn't as important as he's going to get it this way, he's going to become powerful because of this, and he's going to be doing this because his son died. And he would never have gotten involved with the Titans if his son had lived. He had to take over his son's contract. That was the deal he made. So you have a character, and the idea for that was not to make it tragic. I frankly wasn't going for that at all. But the thing was, it put him in a situation where he could not figure out how to get out of it. He had no reason to want to kill the Titans.
Yeah.
He was doing this as a job.
Yeah.
And it was a job he didn't even elect to take. He did it because he promised to back up his son. So you have this character who's so powerful, but he can't extricate himself from a mission he doesn't even want to do.
Yeah.
So that's a weakness in him. It's like, that's a down point in who he is that would lead to Jericho being one of the characters who could get to him because his life with his family affected everything else down the line. So what he did with his son Grant had to reflect what would later happen with Jericho.
Yeah, that's amazing. And also when you just mentioned that's right, the Hive seemed like a throwaway group of villains at the beginning, and then they played a very integral role throughout the whole series. I know Pat wants to ask you something about Adrian Chase. Was he always destined to be the vigilante? Because, you know, Pat made the statues, and when you see it, you're like, oh, I remember New Teen Titans Annual 2 when he shows up. But it seemed like Adrian Chase had been in the comic for ages as the detective guy, and he always had this problem, like he wanted to do more, but he could never do it. So that's why I feel like it was a natural progression, but was it?
Yeah. No, it wasn't natural in that we planned it, but it was a natural progression because we could set it up. We knew exactly that it was going to be in the annual. We knew what the story was because Dick Giordano, who was the editor and president or publisher at DC, kept trying to get me to do them faster. And I said, no, he'll come out when he comes out. The idea is you build these characters, you try and develop them and become interesting as themselves. If Adrian Chase wasn't an interesting character as Adrian Chase, he wouldn't be an interesting character as Vigilante. You know, the all the characters as themselves need to be interesting. They need to have a real life. If you notice, Deathstroke has an incredibly complex life outside of what he did with, as Deathstroke. Adrian as a vigilante had a family. So all these characters were planned, but you have to build them slowly. Otherwise, you don't care about them. If you just throw these characters at the readers, they're being bombarded by 50 other comic books that week, 100 comic books, all these people coming up with characters, but no one cares because they just throw them out there and suddenly you're supposed to care about it. But if you spend the time and build up the character, you will care what happens to them, hero or villain.
I'm gonna guess that you guys were obviously a lot younger back then, because now you mention it.
I was older.
You guys were able to create and produce so many monthly issues in a row. And I remember that New Teen Titans too. I mean, did George even take a break before or after that? Like today, artists don't even do 12 issues a year. You guys had an almost unbreakable run over that first 50.
George missed a couple of issues, but not because he was slow, but because he had to do another assignment that they asked him to work on. Oh. So he had to do this particular thing, and that unfortunately took him away for an issue of the Titans. I could write 4 or 5 books a month, but an artist can't draw that many. He stuck on the book longer than I think on any other title.
Yeah.
And we just enjoyed working with each other and coming up with those stories because we cared about the characters. And today, it's the characters that people think of. It's the characters who made it to the cartoon show that was the #1 show on the Cartoon Network for 6-7 years so far, and it's still on. And now it's going into a 3rd season as a live action series. It's because those characters resonate with people.
Yeah, well, as a fan, I know Pat and I are so happy that you guys were able to stick it out for so long back in the 80s there and create such a great, memorable run. I think that today, right, a lot of teams don't stay on a book very long, and that's why the legacy of the characters in the book don't last as much as they did back in the 80s. Can you talk a little bit about when did the work on the Crisis on Infinite Earths begin? Because you guys are working on New Teen Titans, and then I guess George obviously must have left at some point to go and do these other 12 issues.
Yeah, by that point he had left, which was always the plan, by the way, because he was always going to go on to Wonder Woman. Whether we had done Crisis or not, he still would have been doing that. An artist has to work so hard on these things that at some point someone like George was going, I don't want 4,000 characters. I want to do Wonder Woman because we did a couple of Amazon warrior stories with the mythological gods, and he really fell in love with that, and he wanted to use that as the background for stories that he wanted to tell. And I encouraged him to because his storytelling was so good as an artist. I figured it would be that good as a writer too, and it was.
Yeah. And now that you're going to talk about this, I just want to quickly jump in there with the question about the Monitor. So he was always the plan. You would always, maybe he was a plan to be a villain in New Teen Titans, but he ended up becoming the Crisis on Infinite Earths villain.
He started, when I first proposed it, he started as a hero doing what he was supposed to do, but we didn't know if the Crisis would be, George wasn't involved at this point. I didn't know about the Crisis, so we decided to change it over at that point to a little bit more villainous. And then when I was able to convince them to do the Crisis, we went back to the original concept.
Okay.
He was something that came from my childhood. I had come up with a character who lived in a satellite and had this partner who would become Harbinger. And back then, because I was a kid when I came up with it, his name was the Librarian, and he would monitor everybody. Once I was a professional, I realized how stupid that name was, and instead came up with the name Monitor, which is a little bit more interesting than Librarian.
There's a DC villain called the Designer now, so don't worry.
Yeah, because the Crisis was going to be this huge story. I mean, amazingly huge, and I knew that because I was going to redo the entire DC universe. Um, it had to be a lot larger than that, and every character had to resonate on a much larger scale. You have to rethink everything when you're doing something that's going to change all of DC. And fortunately, we were given the freedom to do what we wanted, and we did.
It's amazing, amazing stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the Titans moving into, I would call it transmedia, right? We've got your comic book is now is a video game, is an animated show, is a live action show. It's on TV. It's on every kind of property. Who knows what's going to happen in the next little while as DC releases new films? Talk a little bit about how were you involved in the original Teen Titans cartoon show that was on not the new one, but the original one that seemed to really be a little bit more mature and a little bit more following a bit more of your storylines.
They showed me for a long time. They would send me the scripts just to look at, but after a while, there was no reason to. They were telling a very different type of show and a really good one. It was a lot of fun. So I didn't need to see the scripts anymore, but they did ask me to write a couple of episodes.
You have an animation background too, right? You wrote a
Yeah.
bunch of TV shows for Marvel back in the 80s as well.
Actually, Marv, I want to talk to you about your work with the CW show, especially bringing that whole Crisis story into the live action. And how was that to translate your story into the live action, especially considering you're limited to the amount of superheroes you can use, but with what you had to work with? How challenging was that to adapt that story?
Well, Mark Guggenheim, who was the showrunner, did most of that. He plotted that thing out, and he did an unbelievable job on it. Considering the problems that one has taking a story that featured 400 characters and the death of two characters at least who they had TV shows on, it I don't know how he put together that thing to make it work because it's complex. I mean, what we did was incredibly complex because nobody had ever done it. So we had to invent the procedure. We had to invent the way that you even start something like this. But that had never been done on television before. You had crossovers like with two shows. So when that one actor or maybe two actors would go, 5 shows, and then bringing characters who appeared in other TV shows long canceled, like bringing in the original Flash from the Flash TV show back in the 80s, or bringing in several of the Supermans, so bringing in, this had never been done, and nobody's ever had gotten approval from all these different networks to allow their characters to be used. It was utterly amazing, and I was thrilled that Mark, who's an incredible guy, besides being a dynamite writer and showrunner, asked if I'd like to work with him on an episode. So I got to co-write one of the episodes, and then, of course, the funny cameo. But it was a thrill to do it. Mark worked out all the details, so essentially I could just put into script form the storyline, and I was thrilled to be able to do that because I hadn't really done anything like that before, and Mark gave me a chance to have one of my dreams come true.
Yeah, that was
How
an
ironic is it
episode to watch, to see you with the Flash and Supergirl, the two characters you had killed 25, 30 years ago.
So that was a great thrill. I enjoyed that greatly.
There's been several iterations of some of the characters you've made. For instance, Deathstroke, you got, Deathstroke from the Justice League movie. You got Deathstroke that was in the Arrowverse. You have Deathstroke in the Titans verse. Do you have a favorite out of all of those? Is there one that you think did the most justice towards your creation?
That's like asking who's your favorite kid. I've been very lucky. All the actors who have played Deathstroke have been really good. Starting with Michael Hogan, who was on Smallville. He played Adrian, not Deathstroke, but Adrian, and he did a great job with it, and he looked like the character. Then going on to Mano Bennett, who did a phenomenal job running that character. He was a physical force. Then Joe I can't pronounce his last name, but Joe looks so good. I really hope to see more of that, more from as that. Then the people are now on the Titans live action show and the various versions that we've seen in the cartoons forms. I've been very lucky that there's no character I'm ashamed about. There's no, like, I'm sure there are situations where people have had their work adapted where they're just ashamed to look at it. And I've never even for a moment had that problem, because the people who have worked on my characters have done a beautiful job with it. They like the characters, first of all, but they also knew how to make it work for their format and their medium. You know, one of the things that the CW people did was they invited me to a meeting before they started, and for 2 hours, all the writers, all the showrunners and writers of the different CW shows were there, and for 2 hours they just asked me questions about the characters and about the crisis, and they wanted to make sure they understood, even if they had to change things because of the format or because of media, they wanted to know what my intentions were so they could find a way to honor the intentions, even if they had to make some changes in how it's done.
I was going to follow up. Is there any character or characters that you've created that you're looking forward to coming on the live action adaptation anytime soon? Is there one that you've always wanted to see?
None that I can talk about.
I mean, well, I just want to go back to that last comment you made. Do you think that today's media, the people working in these big companies, they seem to be a lot more respectful of where the characters come from, right? I mean, we could look back at the old Flash show, or go back to the original Batman show in the 60s, and it seemed like the people making the TV show had no idea it was a comic book to begin with. But today, you know, the CW shows seem to be, and even the Titan show that we're watching now, they seem very respectful at following as closely as they can within budgetary constraints of what you and George did back in these old days. Do you find that to be true, or is it just a natural progression of making the stories more more sophisticated?
Well, I think to a minor degree it's that, but frankly, they're all fans. You know, they grew up, their ages, they grew up reading the stuff George and I did, or reading what Chris Claremont did, or reading what Frank Miller did. They're big comic book fans, and they read our stuff. So there's a feeling that they are honoring the material they grew up with, as my generation, honored the previous generation. But we were my generation of comic book writers and artists were the first generation who were originally fans. The Golden Age guys did create all that stuff, and they made us fans, but they were not fans of comics because there had been no comics.
That's right.
The artists wanted to be comic strip artists, not comic book artists. There were no comic books. The writers wanted to do novels, not comics, because there were no comics. Yeah. So they weren't fans of the material. For them, it was a very professional job. For us, my generation, we were all fans of the stuff, and the new generation are fans of us. Yeah. So they're doing a job, and they're doing the job that they love, as opposed to just doing a job because that pays.
I feel like one of the other characters I want to quickly touch upon is Cyborg. I feel like this character was probably the first one to graduate out of being a new Teen Titan, right? He was on the Superpower show, and now he is on the Justice League. So he's been definitely promoted up toward the top list more than any of the other characters. Can you talk a little bit about what you think about Victor Stone now in this day and age?
Well, again, one of the nice things is that they've taken the character we created, George and I created, and have made him more vital to the company. I was very jealous in keeping all of our Titans just in our book. And because I wanted to make sure at that particular point, I was the only writer of any of those characters, and George was the only artist. The world has changed an awful lot, and there was no Titans when Jeff Johns came back and took over that title and then moved Cyborg over. Jeff loves Cyborg, as you could tell. He put him in the Justice League, the major team-up book at DC. He put him in the Doom Patrol live-action show. He's used those. He's liked those characters tremendously, and he's kept them front and center. So you got to love that.
And then I guess the last thing I wanted to quickly talk about is just the new show, the Titans show.
I really like that. I really like the Titans live action show. It took me an episode or two to get into what they were doing because it was somewhat different. But by the end of season 2, they were pretty much exactly on target with the comic. And I actually started, by the 3rd episode of the first season, I became a fan of the show. It took a little bit for me to get used to the characters cursing or doing all this other stuff. And then it felt natural because what it felt like was these are real people in the year 2020, 2021, and that's the way they would be talking. And I'm still stuck in the 1985 comic book version of the characters. But once I went, okay, fully understood this is up the time period, I really liked the stories and I really liked the characters, and the actors were wonderful. The guy who plays, Nightwing is great. Both Starfire and Raven, the actresses on both of those are unbelievable. Yeah. I just think they're really, really great. I wish there was more with Beast Boy, even though I had nothing to do with his creation. I think he's really good, and I would like to see more. I'm glad they brought in Jericho. He seems really good. I'm anxious to see what they do with him next season. You watch it to the end of season 2, and you realize they're exactly in the place of the comic. It has the same feel of the comic with all the characters, and they're honoring the comic, and they're doing it beautifully.
Do they send you all the new merchandise of all the characters and things like that? Is your house full of Titans memorabilia?
I have a lot, but no, they don't send it.
That'd be too much.
They send a couple of things, but unfortunately not the big statues that are so expensive.
Thank you, Marv. Thank you very much. What can we look? Is there any special projects you want to promote that are coming out soon that we can look forward to?
There's a Wonder Woman story coming out with their big anniversary issue or special issue, and there's a detective story and a Solomon Grundy story, but I don't remember where that's appearing. I don't know. So those are the three next projects coming out because they're already done.
Okay, we'll keep an eye out for that.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Marv.
All right,
Take
Mark.
care.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye. You too.